Nomiki show. We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki show. It is Wednesday, May 18th. And since we aired our last show last week on Friday, there's been another horrific mass shooting. This time in Buffalo, New York. This is where I grew up. And so it hit very close to home. It's extremely heartbreaking to hear the stories of how this happened, what instigated this, what inspired this extremely racist, white supremacist act. We've probably all heard what happened, what led to this situation at this point, but I do want to take the time to discuss it a little bit more. This murderer, this white supremacist, was from a region about 2 hours away from Buffalo in central New York. He had been radicalized not just through mainstream right-wing media like Tucker Carlson, who has mainstreamed extremely far-right Nazi theories like white replacement, but he was radicalized online. And I know you guys will watch the show and listen to the show, know how often I beat the drum on how these algorithms are radicalizing people and how they're racist and how they're sexist. Not only are they racist and sexist in that they are not pushing forward more diversity in who watches these shows, which tweets get pushed out more, but they're actually racist and sexist. The kinds of conversations that get more attention, that are being built up and incentivized through this algorithm are ones that yell at women of color who are in Congress, that push in even further right circles this white replacement theory. So you might start watching a show because they're anti-Democrat establishment, and then the next thing you know, they're anti-vax, and the next thing you know, they're yelling at the squad and women of color for putting identity over economics when those things can be intersectional. That's an important point, right? And then the next thing you know, you're watching Jordan Peterson, and the next thing you know, you're watching Tim Pool, and then you're watching Tucker Carlson, and then he cites white replacement theory, and then you Google that, and then you're suddenly radicalized. This is how this pipeline works. And the tech companies need to be held responsible. I've been talking about this since we launched our show a little over 2 years ago. It became very clear when one day we went from gaining 10,000 subscribers a week to pause. And I started to do my research behind what happens. The tech companies know what is going on. This is not play dumb. This is called they don't want to lose money by changing their entire operating system. Now, was it intentional? I don't know. Maybe in some of these spaces, it is intentional. Maybe it's a blind spot. But when you have blind spots, you fix them. Like when a series of video games was charging for people to identify as a woman in the video games versus men who could play, the icons were male, those were free, but the female icons were charged. When that was called out by a 12-year-old girl in the Washington Post, guess what? Major video games decided, oh my God, that's a blind spot. We have to fix it. Including one video game that was designed and founded by a woman who was embarrassed. This isn't about embarrassment anymore. This is about violence. This is about violence against a community that already has enough struggles. That Tops Friendly Market, which I have probably been to, but for sure I have been to Tops Friendly Markets throughout my childhood. That was in a primarily Black community in Buffalo, New York. He targeted that community because he thought he could reach more people of color as targets. But that Tops Friendly Market was brought to that community by the community. not by TOPS, not by, city planning, not by tax incentives. They were living in a food desert. So they organized and lobbied TOPS to have a grocery store, because otherwise people had to get on the bus and go 2.5 hours transferring through a bus to a grocery store 5 miles away or 8 miles away. This was literally about community. And some white boy being radicalized because he thought he was going to be replaced because he was insecure decided to get in the car with mass weapons and kill a community, leaders, organizers. This is not what we are supposed to be. I know that we have been talking about this forever. This is not just about gun control, although it is about gun control. This is not just about mental health, although it is about mental health. This is not just about tech companies literally being like, oh, can't be held responsible. This is also about leadership. We are in a state, New York State, that is a Democratic state. We have the ability in this state, in the Assembly, in the Senate, and with the governor, even in an election year. First off, in the election year, we should be talking about this nonstop. But because the rest of the country is under attack through gerrymandering and Republican takeovers, and because Congress can't do anything right now because you've got some people holding things up, because our president just doesn't realize he has the power of a pen in a lot of situations, we in New York State can do something. We can do something about mental health. We can pass our own version of Medicare for all and make sure that more people have access to mental health facilities. We can do something about housing. When you're destabilized, it makes you feel insecure. When you don't have a high enough minimum wage to live in New York, it makes you feel insecure. When your schools aren't funded, children may be alienated. But most importantly in this situation, I believe, because of the radicalization that's happening so rapidly, we have to do something about big tech. I'm going to read off the names of the community members who were terrorized and murdered by this terrorist. Aaron Salter was a Buffalo. Aaron Salter was a part of the Buffalo Police Force. He was there for 30 years. He was a security guard. He was retired. He shot back, but did not hurt the terrorist because the terrorist was wearing protective gear, professionalized protective gear. Really horrifying. Ruth Winfield was 86. She was a retired Buffalo Fire Commissioner, part of the commission, excuse me. I'm sorry, I'm just going through all the names. There's stories about each of these women. She was a grandmother. Catherine Cat Macy. She went to pick up groceries for her family. Normal day. Was murdered. Hayward Tenney Patterson. He was very active in his state tabernacle church, and he would drive people to the supermarket who were not able to walk there. He would carry the groceries. Unbelievable. Pearlie Young. She was somebody who ran a weekly food pantry for 25 years. And she was going there to collect groceries that day. Unbelievable. 77 years old. Roberta Drury, 32. She was going to pick up groceries to make dinner for her family that she was staying with. And she was murdered. Celestine Cheney. She went with her sister to the supermarket because she wanted to make strawberries for strawberry shortcake because it's summertime. And that is, I can't tell you how many memories I have of Buffalo strawberry shortcake in the summer. And she was murdered. And her sister saw her body minutes later. Marcus Morrison, 52. Andre McNeil, 53, from Auburn, New York. Geraldine Talley, 62, from Buffalo. These are just some of the stories of the people who were terrorized. And it is a memory, if we remember what happened in another community I was born in, which was Tucson. when Gabby Giffords was shot at a community event in a grocery store parking lot. I remember that day because my grandmother lived down the street and a quarter mile away. And at 90 years old or so, she used to go every Saturday morning for grocery shopping. And that day, she didn't go because my cousin had a baby shower. These things can hit every single community in this country. No one is protected anymore. We have to do something about it.
The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.
All right, we have a really great show today. We're going to be talking about long COVID with our dear friend, Dr. Osgood. Very exciting conversation because we have a lot of questions related to that. I say exciting because I think I have aphasia or maybe some sort of remnant of COVID. I don't even know if I've had COVID, but I feel like I'm having some of the mental blurs all week. Tom Winter is going to join us. First off, he's a former Montana legislator, and he's running for Congressional for Congress in Western Montana right now. And then a little bit later, we have Ted Glick on, who's going to talk to us about his new article in The Nation about Joe Manchin and wearing him down. What is it going to take? What is it going to take? All right, we will be right back after this break. All right, welcome back to the Nomiki Show. We have been talking about what it means to run for office this cycle, which a lot of folks think is doomed for Democrats. But I am of the opinion that there is a lot of hope. We saw yesterday Summer Lee, of course, won in Pennsylvania. Others not so much. Our dear friend Rep Rab, we got to give him a shout out. He won. He crushed his opponent. Crushed his opponent yesterday. So I actually see that there's a lot of potential in this race because of just how far the right wing has gone. They staged a coup. They're pushing up QAnon supporters. It is really hardcore. And of course, everything that happened with Roe. I really believe that we have a shot, especially in these primaries and in rural areas that many people would think progressives can't win in. Our next guest, a former Montana legislator and a congressional candidate in Western Montana, also an IBEW, that's the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, 206 member, Tom Winter. Thanks for joining us, Tom.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You look so outdoorsy. This is like... I am just like such a New Yorker right now going, look at that shirt and that beautiful, there's like green behind you. Western Montana.
Outside and 2 rescue dogs beneath my feet. So it does feel like the outdoors are inside right now. So yes, the smell is not good either.
So tell us about Western Montana, because as you know, as a New Yorker, what do I know? I don't know about Western Montana. I feel like they're just all going to be a bunch of Republicans, but am I wrong?
Well, no, some of them are, honestly. So one of the big things that we say, this new district, I think it's important to say, Montana is the first state in the union to lose. So we had 2 Congress people at one point. We lost them 30 years ago. So we only had 1 for a state the size of a medium-sized country. And now we have 2 again. And so now I am running to represent the Western seat, which is if all, New Yorkers often go to Colorado to go skiing. So if you think about Colorado, Montana is similar in that about a third of it is mountainous and kind of what you think of when you think of Montana, like mountain goats, campfires, guys in flannel. And then the eastern part is flat and looks like Kansas. It's ranch land. This new district is those towns you think about, like Bozeman or Glacier National Park or Missoula. It's the western seat where there's trout fishing and, there's hunting and outdoor stuff. You can go skiing. This is where I am running to represent. And you're saying it's full of Republicans. Yes, it is, partly. And part of the thing that I say, and part of the reason I'm even here before you and think I can do this, is because I am one of the few, I think I was the only Democrat to win a contested seat other than our sitting senator and our former governor in the last couple of years. I ran for office in a semi-rural, suburban, but very rural area to the west of it, in a district that voted for Trump plus 11 points. And it was held by a Republican. He was also the Speaker of the House's son, which no one told me. And as a 30-year-old,
you didn't know that?
They didn't tell me. I mean, I honestly, when you run in a district, when you're a young progressive Democrat running on Medicaid expansion and ensuring people have healthcare in the first place before we even, and I want to, of course, talk about universal healthcare, and we will and do in this campaign, but we were just trying to defend Medicaid expansion. I did not think we had a prayer, but we were able to knit the community back together. And I won as a young first-time runner progressive Democrat in a district that voted for Trump plus 11 points. We never had to shy away from the things we value as progressives, as Democrats, as leftists. We were able to win that seat just going door to door and saying, what do you think you deserve from your government and from your community? And it's the same stuff, you and I believe in, I think.
Definitely do. So tell us about who you're running against now and what are the dynamics of this race? What is your primary?
Well, so we're in the primary. First, I want to say in the general, we got Ryan Zinke, who is that buffoon who worked for the Trump administration, walked in on a literal white horse, literally wearing like combat fatigues for no reason. He's an idiot. But he also stole public lands and sacred land. I'm just telling you. Like,
hang on 1 second. Just flat out, I don't think I've ever heard a candidate say against Republicans. He's an idiot on the record.
This is not just me saying it, and this is not just dirty campaigning. I have the privilege or not to leave Montana and go to D.C. And when people say, I say, well, in the general, we'll be running against Ryan Zinke, and people like and go like that. And I'm like, yeah, but he's incredibly well funded, and he's endorsed by Donald Trump, and he's been the Department of the Interior head. And he is corrupt. I mean, so he's not the smartest guy, but he is willing to sell himself and sell the dignity of this office, which he will do and is doing. In the primary, however, I don't call my fellow Democrats idiots because they're not. We have two other people in the race. We're many more, and then we were redistricted. There's Ryan Zinke right there. The two people I'm running against, again, we are in a small state with very few Democrats, but we do win. And so with respect to the others in the race, I do say things that are like just differences with us. One would be, we're the only race arguing for full-throatedly universal healthcare. We're the only race, the only campaign talking about how we should not be rationing healthcare. We talk, and openly also, we don't take oil money. We don't take corporate money. I'm the only person in my race who's won an election whatsoever. One of my primary opponents actually ran as a Republican and then switched to run as a Democrat 5 years ago. The other one is a professional fundraiser who recently moved here from Los Angeles. We welcome newcomers, and you will see that we certainly do.
What are their names? Name drop.
I'm sorry. I don't want to name drop my opponents.
No, it's good. I understand, but we're in a safe space. This is a progressive space. They're not going to go follow them. They're going to,
They'll hopefully help me out. You can donate to my opponents here. Monica Tranel is, again, someone I know personally. I know both these people, but she ran as a Republican, worked for a Republican state, United States Senator here, Conrad Burns, having extremely, extremely problematic, I'd say, views on people of color. Slave auction. The guy was bad. In her poor judgment, and as a Republican, she worked for him. And then ran as a Republican and then ran and lost and now is running as a Democrat. She ran as a Democrat, previously a centrist Democrat, and lost to a white supremacist. And now a white supremacist, white nationalist is the person who sets my utility bill rates because Monica was unable to pull out that race. Our local liberal paper endorsed the white supremacist. And then I led a campaign, not knowing I'd be running against this person who lost the race eventually, trying to get the editor fired for endorsing a white supremacist against the person I'm now running against. It's complicated, small town stuff. But the thing is, we have two people in the race, one who just moved here, the other who just became a Democrat fairly recently. And I am alone amongst the three of us. I'm the only one who's won an election whatsoever in the first place, and let alone an election that was with Republican support on progressive values. And that's the case we make. That is, my service that I did in the legislature to cancel in-state tuition, which basically cancel student debt. I apologize on that one. Also to legalize marijuana, which the people actually ended up doing. They took portions of our bill, especially around criminal justice reform, went to the voters, Montana legalized weed. We have done this taxing rich people so that we can zero out taxes on middle class and working families. This kind of stuff is the stuff we were working on from the beginning in the legislature. And it's just a natural progression into the Congress. And that is what we're doing every day on the doors, talking to people, making sure we're bringing community together on these issues that really, as you know, poll well across party lines. It's just centrist and corporate Democrats and the entire corrupted Republican establishment that believes this is not possible.
Is it true that a lot of rich people, is it like your LA fundraiser opponent, are moving to Montana and setting up their estates and waiting out the apocalypse and, doing what they do? I guess.
Mm-hmm. They are. I think it's more.
But how much?
How much? Yeah. So this is problem. I mean, this goes so strange. So we think that above 60% of the electorate was not born here. I myself was born in the Midwest. Montana is experiencing a generational increase in population, which will have reverberations throughout my lifetime and our lifetimes, and also will lead to more congressional seats. We're only seeing more of an influx of people from wealthy coastal cities moving here. The thing that's happening, though, is originally it was many people moving to Bozeman. You see this and you've heard about it. Rich people who can cash out of their suburban house and buy the fanciest house in town in Bozeman, Montana. And then Bozeman got Ben Affleck and, Jennifer Lopez going to ski. And then it became like this international place where, housing costs, I think a median house price is now 1.2 million in the biggest city in our state, or the second biggest city.
Wow.
Which is like, it's an Aspen, but it's an Aspen without a Denver. So now we're facing these horrible inequity and inequality in our housing market, in pay. We're becoming a state where you are either the servant class or you are being served.
Right.
And we cannot allow that to happen. We have a long history of egalitarian movements here and progressive movements. So yeah, one thing is you have the rich people who are coming here and they have like a 7-bedroom ski chalet, which they also stock with food. And then but this later thing has been, which is, a better looking version of prepper. But then we're also getting
exactly.
And this is what's disturbing to me, though, is as I'm going through
tax the preppers.
Tax the rich preppers. But we have this problem as well of there are people coming from, say, this. I have a neighbor of mine who recently moved from Seattle or the Seattle area, fed up with. Sorry, now I'm getting a call. Fed up with the terrible internet out here as well. Just completely fed up with what they considered like the liberal Washington state bias or whatever they were talking about. I don't know what it is. Yeah. They're just mad. So they came here. Free speech. Yeah, whatever. They're mad that they want to tackle climate change. So they came here and just wait till I get elected and they'll be unhappy too. They can move to Wyoming. They are here because they watched the show Yellowstone. Literally. They are here because they saw one too many like bad Westerns and they think all of us are like shoot 'em up. It's just not the case. And I will say to people like, no. You might think this is all this big belt buckle bullshit territory. That's not what it is. We have one of the most progressive state constitutions in the nation. We have such a strong right to privacy, which was written on purpose during the fight over Roe 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, to protect the right to an abortion. We have a constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. We don't have at-will employment here alone amongst the states. We don't have right to work. We have very strong union and labor history. This place is actually unusually progressive, especially when you're talking about Idaho, Wyoming, and all of our neighbors here. We have been leading in these kind of populist progressive issues for 100 years, and no one has really talked about it. It's just been happening because we're in the middle of nowhere and we're very few people. And so now we have these new people coming who ingest all this media about like Westerns and, toxic cowboys and Indian shit. And they do not know what they're getting into. And I am coming to their door and saying, welcome. And also please abide by our community standards of concern for one another, of, support for labor and of support for environmental causes, and also support for our Native American neighbors, sisters and brothers, and on the land on which we live. I live on the reservation myself, though I'm not native. This is a place that has been actually at the forefront of these issues for a really long time, but we're being overtaken by people who are simply fed up with having too many organic markets next to their places in Seattle. So they're moving here and we are trying to, teach them our ways. How's that?
I think it's less about the organic markets and more about people that don't look like them. Out there.
Yes.
Tom, I'm sure I'm so fascinated by Montana. I've never watched Yellowstone. I know there's a conservative bias with it, but I may watch it now. I'm fascinated by Montana. When's your primary? We have your website up so people can go donate, but Yeah, when's your primary?
Our primary is June 7th. Ballots are out now. We are on the doors. And I'd say one of the things we're doing, and please support us if you can, we are the first campaign to unionize in state history. I'm a union member myself. We help the Democrats unionize. We are out here fighting the progressive populist cause in a place where people don't think we can win, but I have already won. And if we are not able to hold the line in places with a deep history and a living history of our values that you talk about here on your show, we can't do it in other places either. And so please help us win this thing so that we can bring a possibility of, honestly, I think of working together between where we are here for our progressive rural values and the progressive values of urban and wealthier places in the coasts. We have the same concerns and the same challenges. And I'm here to try and make those links so I can fight for my constituents and constituents who have these same problems across the country.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Good luck.
Thank you.
Ballots are out. Make calls, text for Tom, whatever you can do. There aren't that many people in Montana, so you can make a real difference.
It's good.
Doesn't Kanye live in Montana? That would be funny if you're like calling.
I know. No, he lives in Wyoming. Instead, we got
Wyoming. I'm sorry.
We got Justin Timberlake, which is like.
There you go. That's more funny. Fun. All right. Take care. We'll be right back with Dr. Eric. He's here to answer your long COVID questions. Let's do this. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, really excited because we have Dr. Eric Osgood here today, who is, of course, one of our favorite doctors. He's a board-certified internist, medical director at Mission Hospitalists, and he's a physician with COVID long haulers, and he is here today to answer your COVID questions. Hello, Doc.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you? Although I think I have brain fog, but I don't think I have had COVID yet. So I don't know what's going on. Do I have COVID?
We'll figure it out.
Did I have COVID?
I don't think you have brain fog. You don't seem like it to me, but you never. Okay. We'll talk about it.
This is my first. Okay, let's start with this question because there's a lot of other questions, but this is my question. I will start a task. Like I'll walk down the stairs. This is happening a lot, not like every once in a while. And then I'll be like, wait, why did I come up here again? Not like once every week where it was in the past. It's like 3 or 4 times a day. Is that what they mean by brain fog, or is it something else?
That's part of it. The way that brain fog is defined is basically people describe it as like sluggish thinking. It's sort of a general sense of unwellness and just feeling like your thinking is sluggish. So it can be like little lapses in memory that way, but just feeling like your thinking is slowed down, things are a little more cloudy, you just kind of lost mental sharpness.
Interesting. Wow. And then how long, do they have a sense of how long it affects you? And can you recover? Can you take like omega-3s and get better?
So we don't know exactly what does and doesn't work, but a study out of Harvard Medical School that looked at retrospectively at patients that described these syndromes demonstrated that people do recover. We do have people that are pretty far into this though and have not recovered yet. I don't know what the exact statistics are, but the idea that this is not recoverable and this is permanent, I don't think that's been very well established. As you get further and further out without the resolution of your symptoms, what we do start to see statistically is that the likelihood of spontaneously recovering does go down. So it's kind of a good prognostic sign if you do start to get better earlier on. As people continue to be symptomatic longer and longer and longer, unfortunately, the statistics start to look like it's harder to recover.
What does it do to your brain? Like how does this technically occur?
So this is still being studied. And there are a lot of working hypotheses and theories. Some people think it's neuroinflammation. Some people think that, or some researchers, I should say, think that it has to do with neurovasculitis, which is inflammation in the blood vessels in the brain, particularly the most small, tiny, what we call the microvasculature, the small, tiniest end perfusing branches of the blood vessels before they become capillaries to deliver oxygen to tissue, and that those become inflamed and the inner lining of those blood vessels get injured, and that causes platelets to build up, which then narrows the size we call the lumen of those blood vessels, and then it ultimately becomes a problem of perfusion to different parts of the brain. Why that concerns us is that over time, that can start to cause atrophy in the brain and start to cause changes that may or may not be reversible over time. And so the research behind this is accelerating, and the urgency to establish what exactly is going on here and start drug treatment trials, the urgency is indescribable.
Is there any sense that like if you ate an anti-inflammatory diet or cut back on drinking or took anti-inflammatory medicine or all of the above, that could help you recover?
These are all things that are being studied in sort of interventional prospective studies. And so we'll find out. Generally speaking, there is good evidence for the therapeutic use of anti-inflammatory diets in autoimmune and rheumatological diseases. So there are certainly foods that are good to cut back on. If you are trying to do that diet, it's a good idea to consult with a dietitian. Those are not easy diets to do.
No, they're not.
Other people will try to do things like low histamine diets, which are very notoriously difficult to adhere to. But generally speaking, avoiding red meat, minimizing red meat, getting plenty of fruits and vegetables and leafy greens in your diet, pretty good idea.
Okay, good to know. All right, so here's some questions from other folks. How does long COVID affect people with pre-existing conditions? My concern is my diabetic father catching it.
Yeah, so diabetes was identified as one of the 4 major predisposing factors from the existing research. So if someone is diabetic, that population is kind of disproportionately represented among long COVID patients that have been studied for whatever reason. Again, that we're still trying to figure out. Maybe it's because diabetics over time also develop vasculopathy, meaning disease of small blood vessels, and so perhaps they're a little bit more susceptible to the changes that come along with long COVID. We don't really know, but yeah. So diabetes. Basically, having been exposed to prior Epstein-Barr virus was another one, which is a pretty high percentage of people in the northern hemisphere have been exposed to and have antibodies to Epstein-Barr virus. We touched on that a little bit last time I was on, we still don't know exactly what the more recent research when they actually went back and looked through insurance claims. So this is an interesting retrospective study where they used the notorious UO 9.9. That doesn't mean that you owe $9.99. It means UO 9.9 is the ICD-10 code that we use for long COVID. And when they went back and looked retrospectively at that diagnostic code, they actually determined that about 75% of the people who were diagnosed with long COVID by an actual doctor, not just people who kind of self-reported, I think I have this, 75% of them were never hospitalized for their acute infection.
Wow. Why?
So, the majority of people don't get hospitalized. So you're looking at a disproportionately higher, a number of people. But what we can glean from that study is that you don't necessarily have to get severely sick from the acute infection to end up with the post-acute symptoms. So that's something that should concern us. And again, this is something we touched upon last time I talked to you, which is in light of this, using hospitalization and death to guide policy starts to make less and less sense. If you're now worried about potential mass debilitating events that are going to cause all kinds of downstream problems, from employment in the labor markets to people being denied life insurance. It's a new thing that's emerging. People not being able to to seek employment and to be able to maintain steady employment. The amount of outpatient specialty visits and the amount of money that's going to cost. This is something that I think we should be pretty proactive trying to avoid until we can determine a little bit more about what this is all about. And if it turns out that we've overreacted a little bit, then that's one thing. But I think to play fast and loose with this and then find out that we're going to have this gigantic swath of the population not quite themselves before, pre-COVID, that's going to cause, the amount of damage that can cause societally, it's hard to even fathom.
And in medical debt, and we talked on this last time too. Yeah, it's. So I have a few more questions I'm going to move through here. As of mid-2021, several major medical institutions had set up long COVID clinics. What kinds of treatments have been proved successful, and are these efforts ongoing? Is there any linking of long COVID to previous undiagnosed illnesses like chronic fatigue? You touched on this a little bit already.
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes, and we are finding in our research that there are a lot of overlap syndromes where when you actually look at people's immunobiological profiles, it's not just what we call pure PASC or post-acute sequelae of COVID, and that they tend to overlap with underlying syndromes like ME/CFS, underlying histories of Lyme disease and other previous pathogens. And so that's going to be important to more closely characterize, because it's going to be hard to figure out what's going to work for treatment until you very clearly identify the study population. As far as what's proved to work so far, we don't have anything that's proved to work so far. We don't have any clinical trial result that would meet the threshold where anybody would describe it as proof. We have ongoing research. I mean, I did a quick clinicaltrials.gov search for long COVID and then post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. I maybe came across like 100 studies that are registered. Out of those, probably a third of them just had the word long in COVID, and it didn't have anything to do with long COVID. It had to do with acute infection. The word long was in there for some other reason. And the others were either studies that are sort of characterizing and describing more diagnostic type of studies, not interventional. Of the interventional ones, they break down into usually non-pharmacological interventions, things like therapy, cognitive behavioral treatment, supportive therapy, things like that. Other more like biological, non-pharmacological things are like nerve stimulations and things like that, electrical stimulations, other types of biopharmaceutical stuff that's not actually drugs. Then you've got like your molecular biology stuff, like your monoclonal antibodies and cellular components that derive from amniotic fluid that they're studying, or other sort of proprietary chemicals, or there's one where they're using stem cells and those sorts of things. Yeah. And then you've got your medicine trials where they're using anything from statins to blood thinners to steroids to immunosuppressants. So there's a number of different studies that are registered. The amount of time it's going to take to actually complete them, have them peer reviewed, published, replicated in a reliable fashion, that's going to take a lot of time. We have to have, number one, patience. But on the other hand, I think if we just sit back idly and offer patients nothing pending that like proof threshold evidence, I think we're going to miss out on some opportunities to use more of a precision approach to figure out how to help people out. There have been some things like case series, smaller exploratory randomized and other interventional studies that have been promising. There was a series published where they use a minimally invasive procedure called stellate ganglion block, where they inject a little bit of medicine into the stellate ganglion here, and that offered patients a lot of symptomatic relief from like their dysautonomia symptoms. Wow. There have been some studies that have looked at what we call antithrombotic medicine, so things that either dissolve blood clots or inhibit platelets from forming. There are a couple of monoclonal antibody treatments that have looked, somewhat promising. But as far as like, is there going to be some kind of magic bullet or magic pill that's going to treat everyone? No, because I don't think ultimately this is going to be shown to be sort of a homogeneous condition. I think this is going to be a complex syndrome with multiple stages and multiple subclassifications, and we're going to have to figure out how to figure out who's who. What any individual patient, there's a number of things that could be driving their symptoms. What is it, and what can we do about it? Right now, the only official definition we have is it's been more than 4 weeks and you're still having symptoms. Well, there's so many different things that can cause that. It's unlikely there's going to be one treatment that works for everybody. So that's going to be the challenge.
It's interesting. So in the case, like, say I don't think I've ever had COVID. I've never tested positive. I've taken many tests when, I felt it was probably allergies, and it was only 2 days of feeling kind of, the beginning of spring. I was like, do I have COVID? Do I not? I don't think I've ever had COVID. but I'm feeling that brain fogginess, which could also just be burnout, frankly. A lot of other factors here. But say there are some underlying conditions that I'm not aware of yet, like blood clot would be a great example. Is there some way for me to, as someone who's never been tested positive for COVID, to find out if I've had COVID? I know, I've been vaccinated, boosted. It's in me, but like, is there any way to tell?
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could do would be so you can get antibody testing, but if the main antibody test they offer is the antibody against the S protein, which is the spike protein, and if you've been vaccinated, you'll be positive for that. There's also a nucleocapsid antibody test, and if you've been infected with the actual virus, you would possibly be positive for that. If you've never been exposed to the virus, you would not be positive. However, you can over time stop producing circulating antibodies against that. So if you were to get a nucleocapsid antibody test done and it came back negative, that doesn't rule out that you've ever had COVID. But if it came back positive, that would be indicative that you've had the actual pathogen. And yeah, you can get subclinically infected, not really ever have acute symptoms, or maybe it's just so mild you barely paid attention to it, and then end up with post-acute symptoms. And there, one of the more famous cases from earlier on, before we really knew this was a syndrome, there was a lot of doubt around it. There was a patient, a woman who was convinced that she had COVID. She got it so early on in the pandemic, there really was not widely available testing yet, so there was never any proof. She had tested negative for antibodies. By the time there were tests available, she tested negative, but she was having all the the classicals, the brain fog, the fatigue, the aches, the depression, lack of energy, everything. And her quality of life had dipped, and she was convinced that she was dealing with the long-term symptoms of having been infected. And her doctors were basically treating her like she was a psychiatric patient. And they were insisting she needed to see a psychiatrist. She was just obsessed with having had COVID, and she never really had COVID. And she ended up connecting with some of my colleagues who did some more advanced testing, proteomics and other things that I can't necessarily articulate very well in an understandable fashion with the time that we have. But what they basically found was that and again, this was before vaccines, so you couldn't blame this on having had the vaccine. When they looked inside of her immune cells, we have special type of immune cells called monocytes, which are phagocytes, meaning they go and they gobble up and they eat things that aren't supposed to be there, and then they go and present them to the other part of your immune system. And she was actually expressing the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2 in her monocytes. The only way that could have happened would have been that she was infected and that these monocytes were persistent. And that was essentially proof that she had in fact been exposed to the pathogen. She was not having a psychiatric problem. She was not irrationally obsessed with having had COVID. She had it. And ultimately, she was treated with a combination of medication and did recover fully. Is that causative? Was that just the natural history of her disease to get better during that time? Is it just a relief of being told that she had COVID? Is this, did the medicines actually cure her? We can't really know that until we have, well-designed clinical trials. But this particular modality or this approach to COVID-19, by looking at the persistence of the little piece of the viral pathogen, is behind the aspect of this research that some of my colleagues are working on. There are other people that are working on other angles, like what we call amyloid deposits. So basically, protein trash seems to be stimulated by the presence of this spike protein in its antibody, and that's causing deposits and microclots. Then there's people that are looking at basically your clotting factors going out of control. There's other researchers that are looking at the microbiome in the gut and the connection there, mast cell destabilization. There's so many different angles to this, and there's researchers that are producing very promising sound science. The question is, there going to be one common denominator that connects it all? And that's what we have to find out as a research community. So really what we need is, not just the NIH to dump a bunch of money into intramural research that they do in Bethesda, but there needs to be extramural funding of researchers to come together and form a big research community, collaborate, share findings, not compete with one another, and see if we can, come to a consensus of what's really going on here, what's tying all this in together, which still is largely a mystery. We know a lot more than we knew, and we're making new discoveries all the time, but the big picture and what we can do about it still eludes us.
It's fascinating. Wow. Okay, so we have a few more here. Let's see if we can, maybe some of these can be consolidated together. Are you concerned about the risk of GI bleeds on dual antithrombotic and dual antiplatelet therapy? How do you minimize this risk for patients? And then I think there's one more question that's related. Let me find it. I don't know if this is related, but what do you recommend for LH vascular issues? So those are two questions there.
Yeah, so there has been some early but promising interventional drug research showing that medicines that block the binding of platelets and block clotting factors we call them blood thinners, but that's kind of a misnomer. It doesn't actually affect the viscosity of your blood, but it basically inhibits clotting factors. And these are things that are used to treat heart attacks, strokes, blood clots. And there are some researchers that are showing that either individual, what we call single antiplatelet or single antithrombotic drug treatment, or a combination of multiple antithrombotic or anticoagulant medications offered some symptomatic relief in patients compared to a control group. And there's plenty of, rationale behind why that would be the case. The question is, can that cause bleeding? Absolutely. The least likely thing to cause you to bleed is a daily baby aspirin, although that still can cause bleeding over time. Then you have what we call the P2I12 drugs like Plavix, clopidogrel in that class. And then you have higher doses of aspirin, even more likely to cause bleeding. And then we'll sometimes see what we call dual antiplatelet therapy, where they'll use aspirin plus these other medicines, typically used to treat people that have had stents put in, people that have had heart attacks. Mm-hmm. We can generally use those in the short term pretty safely. In the risk of bleeding is certainly not high, but it is considerable. And to cause someone a major bleed that lands them in the hospital is obviously pretty concerning. And so if you're going to treat somebody like that, ideally it should be in a research setting, or it should be in a setting where you've got pretty good evidence that they have a clotting problem. They should really undergo proper informed consent, understand the risks, and take proper measures to mitigate it, like being on an acid reducing medicine like a PPI. Ultimately, will this be shown to be beneficial? I happen to think so. Some of the people that follow me on Twitter, I did announce that myself and some residents that I work with are in the early stages of starting a clinical trial. We're going to look at that question, and we're going to look at these combinations of antithrombotic medication and anti-lipid medicine, and we're going to compare that to a control group in a crossover setting, which is kind of a cool clinical trial design. And we're going to see if we can determine that patients feel better when they are on this regimen compared to when they're not, in a randomized fashion. So that's going to be, I'm excited about that. But yeah, the answer, the long-winded answer is, yeah, I'm definitely concerned about bleeding, GI bleeding, when you have somebody on multiple blood thinning agents. And if you want to make sure people don't have baseline anemia, especially with iron deficiency. If so, they should probably undergo endoscopy to make sure they don't have ulcers or other sources of bleeding. And other than that, just try to use the appropriate measures to reduce the risk, and just do a risk-benefit analysis. Consider how sick the patient is, how desperate they are, how good your evidence is that this might work, and just be very cautious.
Some of these questions, I'm like, are these doctors that are saying some of the questions?
No, they're not. No, patients are really educating themselves. They're reading a lot. People are chronically ill. They're trying to find answers, and they are consuming high-level, like graduate-level medical literature, and they're reading it. They're understanding it. It's really the amount of self-advocacy I've seen from this community has been staggering, and all the support groups online, and they're asking extremely pointed, brilliant questions where you would take a second to say, wait, are doctors or clinicians asking this? Probably not.
So the next two questions, I don't know how we're going to do this in 5 minutes, but let's try to do it. They're longer questions, so bear with me. I'd like to mention, I'd like a mention on mast cells and how many long COVID patients improve with MCAS protocols. Meds are benign enough that it's worth blindly trying for a few weeks. Also, there's well-established high comorbidity. I do know that word. Comorbidity. I just can't say it. Between dysautonomia present in many long COVID and MCAS. Okay. Second question. I'm just going to put these together and see if we can get them all out. Why is there such a strong focus and almost obsession with the classification of PASC? seems pointless when we already know that the main 5 to 10 symptoms, and there are over 200 symptoms. Why not focus on biomarkers? What?
Okay, no, these are good questions, actually. So, all right. Mast cell activation syndrome is a well-known syndrome, and mast cells will basically release histamine, and that's basically like your hyperallergy kind of syndrome. So people with MCAS are really super sensitive to everything from foods to potential allergens. Their symptoms will be things like flushing of the skin, rashing, sometimes anaphylaxis, sometimes wheezing, diarrhea. Just, when you get really watering of the eyes or the nose, it could be connected to the dysautonomia, meaning basically easily be having your heart rate elevate, or sometimes not having your blood pressure appropriately rise when you go from sitting to standing. And so your blood pressure drops and your heart rate goes up. This is basically a disease of what we call the autonomic nervous system. So they call it dysautonomia. There was an observational study that came from primarily survey data published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases that did show a pretty strong correlation and resemblance to mast cell activation syndrome. I would say if you have those types of symptoms and you have biomarkers that look consistent with it, and you want to try that treatment that you would use, like antihistamine drugs or chromalin sodium or whatever other medications you might want to try, sure. I mean, these are pretty low risk medications that you could use. And if you feel a lot better and those symptoms go away and you take those medications, great. I think it's unlikely that that's the underlying root cause. I think that's probably one of the many manifestations of long COVID that's probably being driven by other underlying things. But if people are taking antihistamine or dual antihistamine regimens and feeling better, that's great. And yeah, sure, give it a try if you think that your syndrome is consistent with that. As far as the question about the classification, if you're going to actually, if you're in the business of actually helping patients on a large scale and doing harm reduction and establishing the ability to treat this, you have to have clinically feasible tools to guide your treatment. So all of the sort of advanced biomarker stuff that we do in the clinical research setting is not easily, widely, and low cost available for physicians, clinicians to do. These things are not routinely used in clinical practice. We're not always sure how to interpret them. So the best thing you can do is establish links to more easily identifiable things like clinical features. And so there's going to have to be a connection between, sure, hard biomarkers are much better to study than symptoms, because symptoms are variable. People are variable when it comes to reporting their own symptoms. It's very subjective. Always better to have objective data like biomarkers and lab results. But ultimately, you have to come up with ways to connect them so that you can use clinical features to try to identify what's going on and how to treat patients. So it's kind of one step at a time. You definitely have to come up with all of these subclassifications, because if you're going to study a syndrome, you have to know what you're studying. And if you have a very heterogeneous population of patients that you're trying to study, it's going to be impossible to determine if anything works, because you're not looking at one and the same thing. And so the step one is always going to be the classification and clarifying what it is that you're looking at.
Oh my gosh. How did you do that in 4 minutes? That was amazing.
Shit, I don't know. But it sounds like you and I have to chat offline a little bit further to go talk about some of these other questions that you have personally. I think, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I would love that, because it's. I think everyone's got their own personalized questions. There are many more questions that are in here, but I think you've touched on most of them. So I just want to say to our audience, I know that there are other questions people asked. I feel like Dr. Osgood, if you didn't get to it specifically, it was related to your question. So, I just, maybe we'll do this again soon, but I'm super, super grateful for your time. If folks want to reach out to you or your clinic, like what's the best way to do so?
You can email me at Dr. Osgood, DROHSOGOOD @gmail.com. You can check out covidlonghaulers.com. Let's see. I mean, you can, emailing me individually. You can DM me on Twitter if you want. Right now, that's probably the best way to reach out to me. I don't really have much of a personal private practice going on anymore. It's just I've got too much other stuff going on, and I'm taking care of like existing patients that I have, but I don't really have the ability to take on anybody new. But if people want to just shoot me an email and I can direct you to the appropriate resource, it's always in general going to be a good idea to look up. If you're in a region where there's any kind of major university hospital or academic setting, it's always a good idea to reach out to see what kind of programs they're offering or research programs they're offering to see if it's something you might want to get involved in. If you are interested in potentially being in a treatment trial because you want medication or working with a group of clinicians that are actually trying certain types of treatments, shoot me an email and I'll do my best to direct you. I'll point you in the right direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your work. You're just really grateful. You're not only are you doing great work for the community and using your practice to really dig into issues that are vital to our existence at this point, but you're a great progressive too. So thank you.
Oh, good day yesterday for progressives, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think so. But great wins, especially in Pennsylvania. So
yeah, exactly.
Keep up the great work. All right, doctor, we will talk to you soon.
Great seeing you again.
Great seeing you too. We will be right back after this short little break to discuss our favorite guy, Joe Manchin. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, Joe Manchin. Oh, President Joe Manchin, you're doing great work, given that nobody elected you to do this. All right, we all know Joe Manchin is at the center of so much being blocked in this country, but let's not forget, much of this is rooted in the fight against climate change activists and having any sort of climate change positions shifted. So much of this country is run off of oil and gas and fossil fuels. But Joe Manchin has his direct ties, of course, to the coal industry, and he's really the advocate for anybody who wants to fight climate change legislation. Ted Glick wrote a piece in The Nation recently titled "Wearing Down Joe Manchin and His Fossil Fuel Allies." Ted Glick works with Beyond Extreme Energy and is president of 350 NJ Rockland. You can go check out his piece right now up in The Nation. Ted, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation.
So let's just do a little bit of a recap on who Joe Manchin is. What are his personal ties? I think people are now familiar that his family's in on it. He's making money, but why? Like, what baffles me is like, why didn't we talk about this for years? And just how bad is it? Like, what is his background with coal? How does it impact his positions? Who in his family's in on it?
Yeah, it goes back a long time. Joe Manchin has been a coal guy. He hasn't just been a friend of the coal industry. He is part of the coal industry. He owns a coal plant in Grant, Grant town in West Virginia. He makes about $500,000 a year from this plant. His son is running it right now. And there was an excellent expose of Manchin in the New York Times that people should check out. It was maybe a month and a half or so ago, might have been like towards the end of March, that really exposes, they really dug into this coal plant that he owns and discovered that over the course of his political career, which goes way back, he was governor, he was, I guess, first, I believe, a state assemblyman, state senator, and then he became governor and so on. He used his positions in office to have this particular coal plant that he owns generate a lot of profit. And what's really just, so outrageous about it, This particular coal plant burns what's called GOB coal, and it's just about the dirtiest kind of coal there is. It's mixed with a lot of like rock and dirt, and it's just dirty coal, and it takes a lot more energy for that coal to be burned, and it's much more polluting. And he did things as governor that made that burning of that particular kind of coal more profitable, while he owns that plant, which apparently is one of the few plants in West Virginia that burns this particular kind of coal. I believe that last couple of years ago, a top official in West Virginia was being interviewed, and he said something to the effect that the state of West Virginia lost, I forget the exact figure, it might have been somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million that had to be expended as a result of the laws that Joe Manchin made happen to benefit himself personally. So the thing about Joe Manchin is that this guy isn't just somebody who is doing everything he can, really, to prevent the shift away from fossil fuels to wind and solar and the clean renewable energy sources. He's just like he's a climate profiteer of the worst type, who right now, with the war going on, is doing everything he can to just stop the movement to renewables and instead to move us backwards. Right. For even more fossil fuels under the pretext that that's what needs to happen in terms of the war and supporting Ukraine. You know, there's a lot of war profiteering that's going on. He's one of the worst.
What just baffles me is like he just sounds like a Republican. He doesn't. I mean, I know this is cliche at this point because of his stance, but I'm almost like, why did he even join the Democratic Party in the beginning? He's an executive. He is a fossil fuel executive who's pushing very conservative stances on everything else. Is this, I don't want to go too much into the politics, but is this just because like he needed unions in West Virginia to win?
I think that definitely has a lot to do with it. You know, the United Mine Workers Union used to be, just a major political force in the state of West Virginia. And if you wanted to get anywhere, it was hard for you to not support them in some way. And I certainly think that that's part of it on his part. The Mine Workers Union is numerically much smaller. The whole coal industry, the number of workers in coal is dramatically plummeted. There's very few now compared to what there used to be. It's frankly a dying industry. Right. Irrespective even of the climate crisis. It really is a dying industry. And instead of, Robert Byrd, before he left the Senate and then died soon after, one of the last things that he did, and this was, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, he talked about how it was that West Virginia and political leadership in West Virginia needed to recognize and acknowledge what was happening, that coal could not be the future of West Virginia anymore. The coal had pretty much been mined, most of it. It was harder to get at, more expensive to get at. There were these new sources of energy like wind and solar that were coming on. And unfortunately, frack gas too. That's the whole big other thing there. But in any case, he recognized what was happening. Manchin is trying to hold back the future. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to do everything he can to support coal, oil, and gas, and to keep us hooked on it, even though what that means is just things we don't want to think about as far as the breakdown of society, the breakdown of ecosystems and the breakdown of human societies. But, just on this thing about wearing him down, right. Where that comes from is there's an agency called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Right. And this is the agency that regulates the whole electrical grid in the United States. It also has the responsibility to make decisions about whether or not the methane gas industry, not gasoline for your cars, but like gas, or like so-called natural gas. Right. They make decisions about whether it can expand, build new pipelines, build export terminals to ship gas overseas, et cetera. And they have a track record over 20, 25 years with the whole development of fracking of rubber stamping virtually every single application of the gas industry for expansion. They do it. They approve it. But there's been a lot of pressure on that agency. I've been part of it with the group Beyond Extreme Energy, and many other groups are involved. There's been a lot of pressure on them to change and to get with the times and to stop being a rubber stamp industry and to support renewable energy and so on. And there was a decision that was made about 2.5-3 months ago by the current leadership of FERC, which has 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. First time that's been the case for 6, 7, 8 years. They actually made a decision to change their policy in terms of making decisions on, expansion of the gas industry, to take into account much more seriously the impacts on the climate, the impacts on landowners whose land, is taken to put in pipelines, impacts on local communities, particularly low income and people of color communities that are most affected by the expansion of all of the fossil fuels. A lot of the pollution is in their neighborhoods where they live. They made a good decision by a 3-2 vote. Manchin 2 weeks later calls all the 5 FERC commissioners, the decision makers, in for a hearing before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee that he unfortunately chairs. Right. And he and the Republicans just grilled these guys, the 2 men and the 1 woman, the three Democrats. They just grilled them. They attacked them. And in the course of that, Manchin said at one point something like, you're wearing my people down. My people are just going to pick up and leave. And what he was referring to was the fossil fuel industry. He was saying that if FERC stops being a rubber stamp, right, has to keep putting up with the whole fight, the fights that can always go on when they want to build one of these pipelines. There's groups all over the country that fight this stuff. He was saying, we're going to just quit. And that's what we have to make them do. That's what has to happen. Yeah. These people, these companies have to stop expanding. Like last year, they needed to start doing that. According to the International Energy Agency, of all things, they said last year that if we're going to solve the climate crisis and have a chance of having a future that's worth living in, frankly, that we need to stop this year, meaning last year, meaning 2021, we need to stop expansion of the fossil fuel industry. Right. So that's what we need. Manchin admitted that because of the movement that's been building and building over the years, that actually we are wearing them down, and some of them are starting to pull out. Some of them are no longer investing. So, Manchin's, he's an enemy of the planet. He really is a climate criminal. He is a climate criminal. He should be indicted, really, for the corruption that
exactly.
He's responsible for.
And he's supposed to be a senator. I've been making outside money. There's all sorts of other things that are factors here. And, Joe Biden does have the pressure to essentially push some of that stuff as he's not the carrot and stick strategy is not working with this man. And so you have to hit him where it hurts. I saw that Senator Mike Lee, you mentioned this in your piece, threatened to basically eliminate this agency, which has been like you said, it's been a rubber stamp for the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it's when regulation gets in the way, they just want to eliminate the agencies and go full libertarian. This is really scary stuff. I say that does happen. Then what?
Well, it's interesting. Mike Lee made that comment, and he made it from the standpoint of let's let the market, let the companies do whatever they want. And then, of course, they always have our best interests at heart. So why worry, right? Yeah, that was Mike Lee's approach. There's actually 250 organizations and presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who have come out in support of replacing this agency, FERC, with a new agency that we're saying it should be called the Federal Renewable Energy Commission, that it should actually be an agency that gives leadership in the fight to shift away as rapidly as possible from fossil fuels to renewables and battery storage and so on. And there's actually precedent for this. The first national electricity regulatory agency was formed in the 1930s during the Depression. It was called the Federal Power Commission. It was officially set up by Congress in 1935. 42 years later, with a whole lot of changes taking place in energy and electricity in the United States, the Federal Power Commission was put out of business, and it was replaced with FERC. It was replaced with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission because there were all these changes that had happened. We're saying, hey, this is now the 21st century. This is no longer a century when fossil fuels are, they can't be in any way the dominant energy source. We absolutely have to get off them. There's all these changes in the way things are working. We need an agency that is like a 21st century agency that's serious about the shift to renewables. If the human, all life forms on Earth are going to have a future. So we're calling for that, and we're working for that. And that's what we really need. In the meantime, we're trying to keep this existing FERC from going back on the decision that it made to have a much more rigorous approach, much more climate conscious and justice conscious approach to making decisions on applications for expansion of energy sources, of electricity sources. Mike Lee was kind of onto something in a backhanded way. His way is certainly from the frying pan into the fire, but we think there's a much better way to go.
Really scary times we're living. I gotta say, the pressure is working. Maybe the next step is drain the lake that Joe Manchin's yacht is on, so he understands the impact of climate change if that lake dries up or floods. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of I don't know how you do it. You gotta hit him where it hurts. No, this is fascinating. You definitely, movement is growing and is being worn down, but it's very sensitive right now. So yeah, go ahead.
Let me just be sure to mention one thing.
Sure.
In terms of the movement building that's happening, there is actually a 12-day walk for Appalachia's future.
Wow.
That is starting next Tuesday, May 24th. It's going to be going through West Virginia, into southwestern Virginia, into North Carolina, eventually coming back, ending at Richmond, Virginia.
Wow.
And definitely part of the call is that politicians like Manchin and others need to stop doing what they're doing and get serious about this shift. They just have to make this change, and we need to make the change in our where we get our energy from, and we need leadership in Congress to do that. So we're meeting all along the way in local communities, in very small little communities that most people like me have never even heard of, where people have been impacted by this reality of the energy system we have. There's a pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, that Manchin is a big backer of. There we go. That's it right there. That's the Facebook website. Yeah. So I would urge people to check that out. It's a good action. I'll be part of it. I'll be on this myself for all 12 days, camping out every night, etc. So
it's Walk for
the movement continues to build.
It's called Walk for Appalachia's Future. You can find it. Yeah. It's on Facebook, but is there another link just for our podcast listeners who don't see the screen?
Well, just go to Facebook and type in Walk for Appalachia's Future.
Okay.
That's the place to go.
Awesome. You can find out information there. We'll put the link in the description box. Ted, thank you so much for joining us. We also have a link up for your article in The Nation right now. Ted Glick, thank you for joining us and talking about Joe Manchin, the enemy of, the world at this point. So all roads lead to Joe Manchin.
Appreciate it.
Really
thank you very much.
To everybody else, if you are not already, make sure to like and subscribe us. Jump in that, wherever you're watching us, Twitch, YouTube, like, subscribe, share on social media. I know many of you do, and I really appreciate that. We have an Instagram account. We have a Twitter account. And if you're not already a patron, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. There you can find swag and lots of other stuff. I'm going to be posting about other projects I'm working on. I think you guys are familiar with the work that I've been doing in Puerto Rico on a documentary. there, I am going to be reaching out to our patrons soon and just sharing some of the updates from the documentary world that I somehow manage on the side. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. As always, stay in solidarity.
The Nomiki Show. Yeah. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.